So hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. And for those that don't know me, I'm Alex Williams. I'm the Director of Customer Experience at Impulse, and joined today for a really exciting conversation with Michelle Page, who is our Head of People Analytics here at Impulse. We want to take a bit of time, 30 minutes, no longer than that, to just take a moment and look at what's happened in the year so far over the last few months, but then look ahead to the rest of 2026. And we feel like we're in a unique position because we work Impulse, which is an employee engagement platform, work with over 100 organizations looking at how do their people feel and why, and then the data around that as well. So we know there's lots of content out there around 2026 trends and where you should be focusing your attention and people's predictions around what's going to happen. We want to take a slightly different approach and really focus on what we're seeing in the data that we've got, but also let you into some of the conversations we're having with exec teams and managers. And so the conversation, the trends we're going to talk about today is going to be based on real life experience. We'll share the current challenges, the emerging trends that we're seeing, and this conversation will really be earthed in reality of what we're seeing at organizations, not these high level theoretical trends. So Michelle, great to have you with us. How are you doing today?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Good. The sun is shining here in the UK, so Michelle and I are in good moods, and you've got us on a good day. And so we'll get into it. Let's start to talk. Really, I mentioned there we are Impulse, we're an employee engagement platform, and we support a lot of organizations. And one of those things is around listening through engagement surveys. And so we've got some data that we're just going to share to kind of set the scene, and then we'll dive into what does that mean? What's some of the why, the trends, and the themes behind that? So we'll start with the headline, which many of you might be familiar with, but engagement is on a slight decline. From our data, Impulse, which has seen a 1 percentage point decrease across 2025, to broader Gallup talked about, there's been a decline in engagement in the last year as well. I think theirs was 2 percentage points decrease. And so from our perspective, and globally, we're seeing a decline in engagement. Now, it's not dramatic, it's not drastic, it's not the end of the world, but it is a negative trajectory. And so we need to look at the why behind that in order to prevent that and adapt and change. Response rates from an Impulse perspective are at 75% is the average. And the high performing organizations are over 80%, they're around 83%. And so really good representation across the organizations we work with. One of the data points that we wanted to talk about today, which is unique to Impulse, again, just trying to give you something different to what others might be talking around, is emotions. And we talk about emotional analytics, and that's based around two key questions. One is, how do you feel about working at the organization? And they can choose up to 2 emotions. And the second is, why do you feel that way? And then they can give a free text qualitative answer from that. And we have seen a decrease in the percentage of positive emotions in the last year. It's down at 65%. So, just under 2/3 of emotions chosen are negative. And so this is the emotional climate that we're seeing across organizations we work with. And as you listen to this or watch this, if you're not an Impulse client and working with us, be interested for you just to reflect and go, gee, what do I think the emotional climate is currently in my organization? What are the dominant emotions I think people are feeling? What am I seeing across the organization? But Michelle, would love to get your thoughts. You're working with a lot of leadership teams predominantly, talking to them about how their people are feeling. What are you seeing generally across the board? What are some of the key themes, the feelings that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think really, Alex, I'm end of 2025 as we're going into this year, it's just starting to feel a lot heavier. Leaders are really feeling this fatigue from their employees, them themselves, but also their employees beneath them. And we know from our data and from talking to our clients, it's not a crisis of commitment. People are still feeling committed, but it's more around this daily friction that we're seeing. The workload, we're asking more of our people with fewer resource. Well, that's leading to stretch roles. And in effect, it's having a bit of a spotlight now on these ineffective systems. So we've gone through lots of transformation. We're seeing that showing up, and processes and systems haven't caught up, which is something we're going to come on to talk about. So these basics of just coming into work and doing the job are certainly draining energy a lot faster. And ultimately, as employers, we're not able to restore that. And some of you may be used to the phrase that we've heard over the last few months, which is the well-being debt. And this is that gap between when the demand is placed on our people, it's consistently outweighing the time, the space, and the support that we're actually giving them to do this recovery. So it's a really interesting thing. And we did a recent podcast and we were talking about changing the R in the SMART objectives from realistic to recovery. And I think that's a really insightful look at the moment as to how we as leaders within organisations to start to support our staff in that recovery.
Yeah, for those listening or watching, you might be familiar with the wellbeing data that Michelle just talked about there, but really we've seen it consistently over the last 5-6 years. And Michelle, since kind of COVID, we saw this piece where since COVID pandemic, people haven't had a chance to recover. And so it's been a relentless flow of difficulty, challenges, from the pandemic, economic and political uncertainty. And we've seen over recent years, technological advancements, now redundancies and restructures. It's been one thing after another. And so there hasn't been that moment, as Michelle said, to recover, breathe, etc. We've also, it's not a phrase we've coined, but others have talked about quiet quitting. So it's this piece of people are continuing to show up to work and do their job, but they struggle in silence whilst doing it. So behind the scenes, they're really struggling. And so it is something absolutely we're seeing on Michelle around how do we support our people? And it's moved from COVID EAPs, so employee assistance programs, to actually moving to exactly that in the day-to-day, how are people feeling supported and connected? And so certainly this heaviness, I would agree with you, Michelle, seeing in the weight of responsibility for leaders and not knowing what to do and carrying the weight of change, but also just generally employees and how they're feeling. So should we talk a bit deeper in terms of, we talked a bit about engagement at a high level and the emotions. Should we look at some of the kind of what we would call 6 patterns behind the data? And so I'm going to quickly introduce what those 6 are, and then there's a few of those that Michelle and I are going to, in the next 20 minutes, just delve deeper into some of those. And so what are the dominant themes we're seeing behind the negative emotions? And the first one is around workload feeling realistic. So a lot of people around feeling stressed and irritated because there's been redundancies or restructures, and so therefore there's fewer people in the team, but the expectations have remained the same, and so that has meant we've taken on more responsibility. And workload is a key thing. Michelle mentioned about systems and processes causing friction in the day-to-day. That links to this workload piece of that I'm expected to do more. However, the systems and processes are lagging behind. Linked to this alongside that is this feeling of unappreciated. So stressed and unappreciated are the 2 most dominant negative emotions across our data set. And this appreciation is low at the moment. It's a key issue for people to tackle. It's, look, you're expecting more from me. My workload's increased, but I don't feel recognized or appreciated or rewarded for that. No surprises. Another one, number 4, is uncertainty about the future and communication not really landing. So people are feeling like there's a lot more rumors and uncertainties happening, and leaders aren't filling the gap. Whether that's look, I don't know, or that's actually addressing key challenges, and people are feeling like there's a lot of uncertainty and it's not being communicated or addressed. Career confidence is another one. So we've seen this is a key reason why people are looking to leave their organizations is career confidence. And we're going to talk a bit more about this later on around, well, what does career development look like in the new age that we're heading into, but also in the fact that, look, we're making redundancies, we're not recruiting. It's not been a driver around recruitment. So how do we fill roles or help people feel confident in their career? And lastly, managers, which Michelle is very passionate about, and we'll talk a bit more later on, is around managers absorbing a lot of the change, and change now not becoming this finite period of we're going through a change program, which is a finite period, but actually it's this ongoing change, infinite amount of change that's happening. And so all of this is affecting how people feel in the workplace, as you expect. It's affecting them emotionally, and it's caused exactly what Michelle mentioned about this kind of heaviness and this fatigue in organizations. And so when it comes to emotions, we look at 3 populations. We look at positive population, which is they feel totally positive. Conflicted is they chose 1 positive emotion and 1 negative. And then thirdly is the negative population, which, surprise, surprise, is they chose solely negative emotions. And so conflicted group is one that we really look at and talk about with exec teams. But Michelle, when you're in the exec rooms, when you're presenting to them, to the exec teams, where are they initially focusing? We've talked around across the board there, lots of these trends and themes. What are they initially focusing on?
Well, often new initiatives, and we have to be that devil's advocate as to whether they're actually working. So I think we could probably put bets on, Alex, how many times this year we've heard we've done a wellbeing campaign or we've done this to upskill our leaders, but clearly it's not shifting the dial and it's not having that impact on engagement. So by us going in and having those conversations, we can really facilitate it to understand where is the shift needed. And a large proportion this year has been in that operational space. It's about how that work is actually flowing. So it's a bit more of an organisation design piece. And just grounding it into a real basic coaching conversation. The thing that what I like to ask, and the passion bit I get excited about, is asking the managers themselves, where are you working harder and where does this need to be? You know, where are you actually firefighting and spending your time doing stuff that's not effective as opposed to leading? Because we hear it a lot, Alex, don't we? You know, I haven't got time to do my one-to-ones. I'm struggling doing this, and this element of frustration they get just because they've got so much bureaucracy and processes that are holding them back. And just literally encouraging them themselves to take that ownership and allowing the processes themselves to be reviewed and shifting, that's going to have that big impact on engagement and shift that dial.
Yeah, a lot of the conversations we're having less around this high level strategic priorities of, you know, whether it's an inspiring vision or a new strategy, etc. And a lot more is exactly that, Michelle, spent in how do we address some of the realities in that local working environment, that friction in the system that we talk about, which is communication landing at a local level with frontline, offline teams? Are we improving facilities and equipment? You know, I was with a client last week, and they were talking about one of the key things that came out of their engagement survey, that in transport, in rail, and one of the key things came across depots is, look, we want coffee machines, so we're gonna have to buy our own coffee. Real simple thing, and you know, it's had a massive impact in improving morale. So it's not this high level strategic program; it's actually fixing those facilities and that equipment or workflows, etc. So
completely. Yeah. I think a lot of it this year has been back to basics, as we would call it, wouldn't it? You know, just literally some of the good stuff that we historically have done that we need to unpick, and where we've added extra layers of fat into processes, or we've moved and taken away some of that good stuff. A lot of the conversations have been around that back to basic mindset.
Yeah, perfect. Well, link to that then, we're talking about that local level, the kind of friction in the system, the day-to-day. Let's talk about managers, which I know is something you're really passionate about, Michelle. So much of what happens at a local level requires managers to take action, right? They're the ones driving action at a local level. They're setting the culture, they're engaging with their employees. However, this will be no surprise to those watching or listening, is managers are feeling overwhelmed. We know that their responsibilities have expanded. They're often referred to as the squeezed middle, and feeling it from above, higher expectations, but then also they're expected to do more with their team locally, and not from an operational perspective, but also care for them, support them, not be well-being experts, but support them in that, etc. So our data, let me quickly share some Impulse data, supports this. Just over a third, so 34% of managers don't feel like they can achieve a healthy work-life balance. Only 69% feel able to perform their role to the best of their ability. And externally, so that was Impulse data, but Gartner reports 75%, so 3/4 of managers feel overwhelmed by growing responsibilities. And so we're expecting more from these managers, but they're also feeling overwhelmed themselves, and they're not performing to their best of their ability. As they've said, they're lacking that capacity. And so, Michelle, when you're coaching these leadership teams, when you're working with managers, what do you see happening at a local level? What are some of the things you're hearing? Where are you telling them to focus their energy?
Well, there's two things for me. The first thing is this: expectations have certainly expanded. We're asking more, as we said. You know, we call it the squeeze middle, as you said, Alex. But actually, you know, just think about what we are now stacking on these managers. We're asking them to lead transformation. We're asking them to be mental health first aiders, do the emotional intelligence and IQ, the piece that we're, you know, be more sympathetic, empathetic. And a lot of them have done that just by purely being pragmatic as we navigated through COVID. But it is an additional requirement that we're asking of them. And we're also asking them to be more accountable, take more responsibility. So listening to an organisation the other day, and they're saying their CEO wants them to be more accountable for the communication. So we want to empower them, but we're asking more of them as well. And I suppose the second element of that then is this role design. So the role design for a large proportion hasn't kept the pace. So a large proportion of managers that we do the coaching with are saying, actually, if you look at what I do in a week, and we talk about them, you know, asking them to journal their activities and look at their time patterns, a lot of that isn't actually stuff that they're meant to be doing. It's not necessarily stuff that's part of that role itself. So we've been stacking additional things. You know, we're asking them to, you know, behave in line with our behavioural framework, so we can ask them to be that cultural carrier. We want them to also performance coach our employees. And more recently, as we've seen quite heavily at the end of last year, lead this change and be these change agents. So there's lots and lots of things in addition just to doing their operational day jobs as well. So there's a few things that I've been asking through the coaching one-to-ones that I do, which is, as a leader, what are you really expecting of your managers? And I suppose if you just pause and think as a listener, what am I expecting? It's quite a thought-provoking question. And then where can we remove some operational burden? And this isn't about waving a magic wand, because some of them will look at me at that point and think, yeah, you're not living in the reality of what I have to deal with. But actually there is, and I'm sure you can sit here today and think there is some stuff operationally that we can remove, and we'll come on to talk about that with the likes of AI and technology advancements, or just looking at the role design, this challenge around stuff that managers are now doing that other layers in the operation should be doing themselves. And then lastly, the question is, how do we equip them in the moment? So how are we as leaders coaching our managers to think and do the right thing, as opposed to sending them on a formal course? And this is what we were saying earlier, Alex, isn't it? We hear in the boardroom quite a lot, but actually for this middle management, for them, that is actually squeezed on them on their time as well. So those three kind of questions, just think, sit and pause yourself and go back to your teams and ask those questions. So what are we expecting from the managers? Is there anything we can do to remove some of this operational burden, that OD question? And then lastly, how can we equip them to think about and coach them in the moment, as opposed to sending them away to do some development stuff? And it's certainly something that's struck quite heavily in conversations over the last 12 to 9 months in particular.
Yeah, it feels like a real reset moment, doesn't it, with managers across the board, which is, we've got to a point where we've just added more and more on managers, and then suddenly we've got to a point where we go, this isn't sustainable, right? All the feedback we get from managers, from what we're seeing in workplaces, is, look, this isn't sustainable. So it's a reset. And I really like you said that, setting expectations, Michelle. And a lot of the work you do is around 360s. And so what does it look like to be a leader in this organization, alongside a leadership behavioral framework, and then measuring that through 360s, right? And do you just want to bring that to life a bit around what that looks like around the setting expectations?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. I was listening to a podcast earlier and they were saying that a lot of organisations just aren't bringing it to the table. We don't see the value in the behavioural competencies. But if you think about it, if you're getting people to join your organisation, you're assessing them against their alignment to your values and how they're going to work. And I think over time, people have let that go. And so the work that's gone into that, we kind of think if you've got a good performer and they're bringing productivity in, that's okay. But more importantly, we want these leaders to be our cultural champions. They are the people bringing the people into the organisation to align. And so to do that, it's really important to have that behavioural framework, but then two, assess them against it. It's great to have an appraisal, that up and down conversation, but that's not really digging into the full wraparound perspective. What do our direct reports think of that manager? What do our external stakeholders, customers, clients, unions, etc., think about that individual? So the 360, and I'm hugely passionate, I could probably speak a whole episode on just 360s, Alex, as you know, but that's really given them that insight into what is that alignment back to the behavioural piece and the values, and they are, as we said earlier, that cultural ambassador. So it's an incredible tool, and I think also for the leader themselves gives them a really clear action plan around where they can go to task and where they need to work. So yeah, I think it's a great thing to have, but it does need to be carefully crafted alongside a set of behavioural frameworks and expectations.
That's nice. The third question you mentioned as well was, you talked about how do we equip them in the moment rather than sending them on these courses. You mentioned about sending them off on these courses because we know they don't necessarily have the time for that. And I'd love you to talk about, and we previously talked a lot about this with organisations, around this peer managed community that you build. So less about them going off to do a course for a finite period of time, feeling part of a community that support each other, connect, etc. Could you just, within 20, 30 seconds, just explain what that looks like and how that works?
Yeah, so for a leader in the moment, literally just asking them in that coaching question. So the big open wide questions around what they're going to do and how, and what the next step might look like. But also, as you say, give them a resource within people within the organisation who can support them. So we've got some great organisations we work with learning management systems, and on there, obviously, they've got communities where they do coaching action groups. So it might be, for example, it might be about career development, and this manager is in a place where they've moved up the organisation quite traditionally, and actually they've got an employee that they need to support moving on a lateral move. And so as a leader, you can support that manager in saying, actually, we've got an action learning group, we've got some specialists in the room that are made up of some L&D people, some project management, for example, or operational people, and you can bring that together as a community to really solution that. And bringing those talent cohorts together. So yeah, there's other ways as opposed to necessarily sitting or designing or investing in formal development programs.
Yeah, nice. And next kind of where I want to go next is talk about a key area for managers around human skills and recognition. The key thing, and I mentioned up front about people feeling unappreciated and recognition being low. It's a key kind of driver behind this heaviness and this kind of negative feeling across organizations, and recognition still remains one of the biggest gaps we're seeing. Again, Impulse data shows less than 2/3, only 63% of non-managers feel recognized when they do good work. So you think you've got over 1/3 of the organization of non-managers that aren't feeling recognized. And we also looking at segmenting by managers and non-managers. There's a perception gap, what we're seeing here. So 82% of managers believe they support their team well. So, a very high percentage there. But in reality, only 70% of non-managers agree with this. Only 70% of non-managers feel supported. And so managers think they're doing better than they are. There's a perception gap. And so, Michelle, how do we fix the recognition problem? We've heard that so many times, but I've introduced flexible working. We're doing X, Y, Z. We've improved the canteen, and yet recognition and appreciation is still so low. How do we address this?
It's a really good question, and I think we're working quite closely with organisations now, and I've been guilty of it when I was in HR. We 9 times out of 10 treat it as a bit of a campaign. We put formal recognition processes in place, but actually we forget just to do the human element and getting managers to treat it as a habit. Constantly having that conversation with their employees. And as you said, really that perception gap is incredibly critical. And we know from psychological safety, so the work that Amy Edmondson's done on that if trust breaks down when leaders think they're being supported in their team, the team are going to clearly experience something quite differently. And that gap then itself exists because people don't necessarily complain. They just start to withdraw, they start to back off, they don't contribute, they don't give them the ideas. And so they stop raising any of those concerns that they might have. So it's not just about the praise and the pat on the head, but it's more about the credibility that people are going to get. And it's about whether people actually believe their manager really sees that contribution. And it was really interesting. I was listening to a podcast with Benny Brown, and she was talking about actually sometimes managers forget to acknowledge effort, because we think that managers need to praise and recognise output and performance. So if somebody doesn't bring a sale across the line, for example, in that environment, actually that manager might pass that moment to say, great, high five, well done. What she said, and I think is so right, and it's something we talk about in coaching, is actually stop and recognise the effort. And a great manager at that point would coach them through that conversation. So you've made a great effort, and they're recognising that, but they're actually then asking, why have we not been able to turn that effort into a performance target achievement? So it's a great way of looking at it, and actually that takes effort and time. But actually, as a manager, if you're making it a habit and you're doing it as part of your weekly one-to-ones, then that's going to have an impact. So for me, it's incredibly important that it's not just this initiative that's owned by a central function. It actually becomes something that managers do on a frequent basis. And I think also we've seen quite a lot in the data. You mentioned it earlier, Alex, around this important connection with career development, because obviously careers are also part of that recognition for a large proportion of people. And our data has found that 56% of people believe there are good career opportunities. So there's nearly half of the workforce available that are saying we don't think there's career opportunities with us within our organisation. So we spent a lot of time this last year working with exec teams to say we need to rebuild some of this career confidence. We know, because we see it, that there are career opportunities in your organisation, but you need to remarket some of that, reposition yourselves, champion lateral moves. So again, they're not thinking just the up and down. But more importantly, sometimes again, managers need to have that honest conversation. Is this person expecting a career move, but they're not quite ready because there's maybe a perception gap? And just make sure that there's no ambiguity there as well. So again, it's another thing we're asking managers to do, but it's an incredibly important thing, and it becomes a habitual thing as opposed to a campaign or initiative.
Yeah, the career development one's an interesting one, isn't it? We have talked a lot about internal marketplaces in the workplace, and so where previously exactly that'd be a lateral of, oh, the role above me is now vacant, I would then assume I can apply for that and get that role, and it's very lateral. Actually, it's now the internal marketplace, for those that aren't familiar, is actually there's lots of like opportunities, whether it's a gig, whether it's a project, whether it's a secondment, whether it's a full-time role, and it will match people against those opportunities in the organization. So if there's a certain skill set I want to develop in, be on my performance reviews and my one-to-ones as part of that, and it will then connect me and go, here's a project that you could then grow in those skills that you want to. But it also lead with the skills demand for the organization as well. So what skills do we need in this particular project? It will look at Michelle's strength. She's good in this area. Therefore, let's position her to be in that project as well. And so it's a real forward-thinking way. We know not everyone can do that immediately right now. It's where people should go, is look at this internal marketplace.
Yeah. And it really works. Like you say, it's a free resource that ticks two boxes. It's, you know, I certainly did that when I was in HR before. We had a set of business priorities that the 9 exec team members just couldn't get around to prioritize all of them. It's kind of that next tier of activity down. And so we got our talent cohorts to work on it. So it was great for them. You know, they were getting mentorship from the exec. We were getting some things delivered. And actually it gave them, you know, 3 or 4 opportunities to work with other people across the organization, but also have that kind of in the eye line of the exec team as well. I think for a large portion of them that worked, that kind of satisfied their needs as well. So yeah, I think it's a great initiative just to seek out some of those opportunities.
Okay, we're coming into land then. Kind of got 5 to 7 minutes left. I'm sure those listening or watching are absolutely shocked that we've been talking for this amount of time, Michelle. We haven't mentioned the A word. We've not mentioned AI in one moment yet. So look, we know AI is a key topic. Lots of people are talking about. We can't not talk about AI. We know it's changing the way organizations are working. This will only increase in the years to come. We know it was Gartner that have done a lot of work over the last year around this. They come out and said adoption of generative AI has risen from 19% to 61% in under 2 years. So look, we know AI is taking over. It's not actually taking over. We know look, it's coming into play a lot. It's moving from this tool that people use to a teammate. You might have seen last year the Microsoft Work Trend Index report reported that essentially AI is going to shift from people using it occasionally to these hybrid human and AI teams, where AI agents handle large chunks of the workflow and humans just oversee the outcomes, judgment, risk, etc. And so that is where we think it is going, to these hybrid human AI teams. What does this mean? These organizations need to reimagine their organizational design, the skills that are required. We just briefly talked about skills there. We talked about the development opportunities. We think organizations are increasingly going to be managing talent by skills and capabilities rather than job titles, and that links to that internal marketplaces we talked about. So we expect there to be a lot more emphasis on like skills-based frameworks, so classifying skills into categories and subcategories, and then matching people dynamically to work. And so it means that the skills required in organizations is going to look very different in the future. And so part of what Michelle talked about around defining expectations around leaders and managers earlier is also defining, well, what's expected of our people as well. So the skills that we require are going to look very different. And so a couple of organizations we work with are already starting to reimagine and think about what our training and development programs going to look like. They can't be traditional like we previously had. And so that's one thing. I want to throw out a couple of stats very quickly, and then Michelle, I'm going to hand over to you. But World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report last year said 85% of employers plan to prioritize upskilling. So it's a huge focus area for a lot of employers. 85%, 39% of existing skills will become outdated by 2030, which is a scary thought. Almost 40% of current existing skills will be outdated in the next 4 years. They highlighted, you can look at the report yourself, they highlighted technology-related skills. The top skills for the next 5 years are going to be AI and data, shock, networks and cybersecurity, and then technological literacy. However, alongside that, they also talked about some non-technology related skills. So creative thinking, resilience, curiosity, lifelong learning. A lot of these skills that, as you start to look at shaping your leadership development programs, you want to start embedding some of these skills into that. So, Michelle, as we kind of come into land, I want to ask you a couple of questions. First one being, what risks do you see if organizations chase after AI without really focusing on what that means for employee engagement, enablement, leadership culture? So, yeah, what are your thoughts?
Well, for me, if you're going down that path of just accelerating it, you're just going to accelerate the pressure we talked about earlier. So it does need to be planned and timely. We know, as we talked about, workload for a large proportion is already unrealistic. And then if we don't embed the technology alongside that, then there's going to be this gap where people are just absorbing it. And so there's going to be this pressure pot again of increased perception of increased workload and this unhealthy tension that we're going to feel. So instead, I see it as a bit of an opportunity in a different way. So instead, using it to actually remove some of that friction. So where we talk about the squeeze middle and the line managers, how can we use AI to reduce some of that admin for them? We're already using it on our platform, and it's allowing them to see that insight at a quicker, faster way. So we're reducing time for them already. But actually, on a day-to-day basis, how can they use Copilot, ChatGPT to start to reduce some of that burden that they're seeing already? And again, that's what we alluded to earlier with the work design.
Nice, perfect. I'm going to keep us moving, if that's all right, because I'm conscious of time. So coming into land, we talked about the emotional fatigue, the impact on well-being, and that well-being debt piece. We talked about friction in the system, so those systems and processes creating friction in the daily work and the impact on workload that's having. We talked about the importance of managers and creating capacity for managers and setting expectations around what it looks like in leadership positions. We talked about recognition, the career pathways, and then we've just finished there with AI and the impact on organizational design and skills. And so, Michelle, anything else before we finish? Anything else you think you're seeing across organizations you think it's worth mentioning?
Probably two things. First one is communication. So working quite closely with clients, and that this challenge around where we've had transformation programs going, that we know there's not that clarity and certainty that employees can give, and so employees are feeling anxious about the unknown. So communication is incredibly important. And this stress and uncertainty that you mentioned at the start, Alex, that's really shaping that experience of people. So they need this safe space. We need to create this psychological safe mindset, and the leaders need to be honest. So from my perspective, encouraging leaders to communicate with clarity and consistency, but giving them that space to ask the questions and share how they're feeling, creating that culture where people can be open and honest. And I think they would be my last two sort of takeaways.
Just jumping on the piece you talked about communication there, which can sound really obvious to people. Well, of course, communication. We're humans, we need communication. Yeah. One of the things we've talked a lot about with leaders is where you've got a lot of uncertainty and unknowns, you need to over communicate, as you just mentioned there. And so where previously you may have communicated a message once or twice, now you need to 5 or 7 times for it to really land, for you to really hear it. And so, Michelle, what some very practical, I'm trying to make it really practical and tangible for people, some really practical things leaders or organizations can do around this communication piece?
Just set it as a rhythm. Use the diary, make sure it's in the diary, weekly team briefings, weekly one-to-ones, and then obviously you've got your senior meetings above that. So it becomes a habit again. So the communication part moves into that. But share the decisions that have kept. And we know, working with leaders on a coaching capacity, but equally from the engagement survey, that people avoid difficult conversations. It's human nature. And the best leader in the world will still avoid that. So make sure that, as difficult as it is, we share what those decisions are. And so people feel part of that decision making and they understand the reasons why. I think one thing we forget when people are under a time poor, which we're obviously seeing at the moment, is that they forget to close the loop on things. So that momentum stops. So take the time again, diarise if you need to, actually close the loop, ideally within 10 days on anything that you've heard from your workforce. And we know a large proportion of these listeners on the call will also have operational staff. So make sure that frontline voices are brought into the communication piece. We've heard it with a client recently, and I think it's a great way of looking at it. Actually get them brought into the comms, make sure they are part of the corporate comm alignment. So, shake it up a bit instead of it coming from central comms, make sure that they're brought into it. And then lastly, the passion piece is obviously coaching those senior leaders on that active listening piece. And again, when they are time poor, the listening goes, and we're all guilty of it, we forget to actively listen. So they would be my little takeaways, Alex.
Perfect. And Michelle, I'm going to tee you up now. I'm going to get to close. I'm going to ask you to, you're a coach, for those that don't know, Michelle's a trained coach. I'd love you to leave everyone with kind of one coaching question to have a think about. So what I'll give you a moment to think about that. I just want to close by hopefully you found it useful for those listening and watching. We've tried to make it really practical but easy in terms of what we're seeing with some examples, etc. But the main takeaway, hopefully, that's come through in this conversation is that in 2026, we honestly believe engagement will be shaped less by these new initiatives and far more about how work feels in the day-to-day, those workflows, those daily frictions, etc. Feeling those moments of connection, feeling connected to my team. And so much of that comes through at that local level through managers. And so that it's really important this next year you invest in managers, you look at how you create capacity for them, but also what those skills look like, what it looks like to be a leader and a manager this year. And so hopefully it's been really clear. Michelle, any closing question for people to leave with and consider?
So I teed it up earlier about the daily friction, and I said I know a lot of people ask that. I think look at me and frown at me when I ask it, but I think it's a really good one, either for you to set on a personal level or think about what you can do wider. If you removed one source of daily friction, either your friction or the organisation's, what would that shift look like, and what could it be? So if you remove one source of daily friction in your organisation, what would the shift look like?
Perfect. A great question to end on, Michelle. A good one to people think about. So, Michelle, thank you for your time. Thanks for your input and your generosity with all you've shared. To those listening, look, we know it's a really busy time. We know people don't have a lot of capacity at the moment. So, thank you for taking the time to listen or watch this. And look, we hope you found it useful. If you've got any questions, anything you want to talk out, we are more than welcome to have a conversation with you. And so, take care and thanks for listening.